All right, welcome back, and this is what we will be taking into Full House 7th edition. With the benefit of hindsight, I can say that this is not my finest work. Let's start out with the good. He's close to a full rainbow, missing death, which is a little sad for our nation, as we discussed before. That's a path that we get, but aren't super high in. Still, we can climb it, so not the end of the world, but otherwise, most magic is available to us, though in many paths, not necessarily the most challenging spells to cast. We will definitely need some help. But with enough boosters, most things are possible, and that is always useful. It's the nature of rainbows. This is, of course, mostly focused around the Bless. Our scales are not in a great place. However, I could not bear actually pulling the trigger on a full Hell Bless. So we're sitting kind of in the middle, which I think is probably not a great place to be. Because while these scales are bad, they're not awful. We do have 2 growth. That was probably a mistake. I would recommend 1 growth when you're a blood nation, because there's a blood spell you can cast to grow, your most important provinces. And especially in the early age, a lot of the provinces are pretty low population, so it's not the end of the world if they're not going to grow, so long as you can make your really valuable provinces grow. So we're not really taking proper advantage there. Probably the most painful bit is Full Misfortune and Drain, so this opens us up to some pretty nasty events, I believe. We're only at Drain 1, so that's maybe not the end of the world. I don't recall offhand. Potentially at Drain 2 and 3, there's some even worse events that open up for us, probably. But still, this is kind of a notoriously bad combination, so we'll see what comes to that. Full Cold can be a little dicey, for reasons that we discussed, especially, this is the early age. All nations are going to be in it. Niflheim will exist. If we spawn next to Niflheim with Full Cold, we do at least have major cold resistance in the Bless, but, still, that could be a little scary. And then from an early production standpoint, the Sloth long-term I think won't hurt us all that much, but especially out of the gate, the Vanheers do have some resource requirements. So early on, that's going to make our life a little bit more difficult. And then we only have 6 holy points. Vanheers are relatively expensive, and then when you combine it with you're usually taking not very good scales if you're focusing on running a very strong bless for them. Absolutely, if you can get away with going higher and recruiting more Vanheers, go for it. But I found that money, beyond this point, oftentimes money was just a limiting factor for me. But a lot of our mages are sacred, so this really kind of translates into 5 Vanheers a turn max, unless we're recruiting a dwarf. So overall, in terms of the Bless, I would say that this is kind of just a worse Blood Bond Barkskin. So that's a very common Bless that people do for Vanheers. Barkskin just gives you more protection than Hardskin, which would definitely be nice. The problem with Barkskin is that it uses up nature Bless points, so that means no poison resistance. Wow, or you're going to spend a lot of design points going very high in nature in order to get that poison resistance. And when I was putting this together, this is very on meta, right? All the full resistances. But part of that is because I was trying to, as much as possible, have the Bless apply to our commanders as well. The resistances are really useful for your thugs. You absolutely can use items to cover holes, and probably if I was to redesign this Bless, I would cut at least 1, maybe 2 of the resistances, and then just focus on covering those, with items. But of course, that does cut in, right? Then you can't give them stat items, and that's also gems, which is always a serious expense. And furthermore, right, a lot of these, in order to forge some of these resistance items, you're going to need gem types that you don't have to start with. So you don't have nature, but maybe it's easy to find, so you cut that one. You don't really have water at all, so maybe, you hold on to that. Water mages are a little harder to find. Obviously, you have a lot of air mages, so you cut that one, but now you're using air gems to forge, shock resistance gear for your guys. Plus, the Vanheers definitely like this. Having shock resistant troops as Vanheim, you're going to be throwing out, a lot of lightning. So shock is, I think, a nice one to hold on to. So anyway, all the resistances are very useful for both the Vanheers and your thugs, your Van Jarls and your Van Herses. Obviously, of course, your Vanadrots are going to like it as well. I mean, again, pretty much all of your mages are sacred, barring the dwarves. Of course, the Blood Bond and the Hard Skin, they don't really do anything for the commanders. It's not the worst thing for your commanders to have a little bit of extra protection, but again, they mostly rely on defense, so it's not super useful for them. It certainly doesn't hurt, and it does help a little bit, but not a recommended bless if you're trying to focus on them. The Vanheers definitely do like this, but +5 is a little on the light side. Blood Bond helps with that. Blood Bond very strong on Berserkers, but that really does do. In fact, it's actually kind of bad for your commanders because they're not Berserkers, so there's really nothing to trigger there, and this is just going to spread damage out to them. So ideally, in large battles, with this sort of setup, with having Blood Bond, you're going to want to spread your commanders out so they don't get hit by a single Thunder Strike and you lose a bunch of them. There's maybe some interesting things you could do here, bringing maybe like 2 thugs into a province, like stacking them on each other where they both buff up and then end up fighting quite close to each other. Potentially spreading out the damage could help a bit. But I would say this is mostly just downside for your commanders. So I was trying to have as much apply to both as possible, but this is definitely still more focused on the Vanheers. Happily, magic weapons and low light vision, uncontroversial picks, I think. Maybe low light vision, I'm not sure how much people like that, but I find that dark situations come up surprisingly often. So being able to mitigate that a little bit, both for your Vanheers and your thugs, I think is quite nice. And then none of your commanders, as far as I recall, actually have magic weapons. So often you're going to be giving them, a magic weapon that you forge, in which case, this isn't super useful. But this does make their default weapon, just a little bit more useful. It's going to be, if you go up against Therados, maybe you don't have to give them, a Frostbrand or something like that. But again, this is mostly for the Vanheers. The nice thing is that really, even without a bless, the Vanheers are still pretty scary. And having them, all Berserk, essentially, the Blood Bond is pretty effective at getting them to all Berserk. And the Hard Skin, does make them significantly more survivable. And the fact that, a lot of them are Berserking and then getting that extra protection, having only taken a little bit of damage thanks to Blood Bond. When this is fully active, the Bless works pretty well. There's no additional strength on here or anything like that. We're relying purely on the Berserk to boost the strength up. So that gets us pretty high, but definitely not out of range of some shenanigans if people are really layering buffs on. So that could be a problem. We are a thug nation. So, the thinking there is well, if we run into something that, is really, really difficult to get rid of, we can make great swords of sharpness. We have really effective commanders that can carry it. They've got all these resistances built in. So, we should be okay on that. But definitely something to note that, even with this setup, someone could create something that would be, immune to your Vanheers. Really, I think probably the main problem is that we've chosen to go dormant. And that is to get these lovely scales that we have, which, not great, but certainly a lot better than they could be. But that means that since, Hard Skin and Blood Bond, they're both incarnate only. So we will not have pretty much the most important pieces of our bless during expansion, right? Pretty much everything else on here is worthless in expansion. I mean, don't get me wrong. Maybe you run into a Cloud Mage and you're good thing I have shock resistance. There's a few things that can help out occasionally, but for the most part, these resistances, they don't matter during expansion, right? So we're kind of losing out on the most important parts of our bless during expansion. Again, Vanheers can absolutely expand without, a bless. That's not a problem, but not without attrition. And since we don't have great scales, we're not going to have that much money, and we don't have a ton of Dominion points anyway, so it's not like we're going to be swimming in Vanheers. And we're also going to be pretty vulnerable until this fellow wakes up. It should be on turn 12, but it's not guaranteed. So absolutely some gambling going on here. Also some gambling going on in the sense that we have incarnate parts of our bless that we do quite care about. And this fellow only has 10 hit points. This is something that I did not really think about ahead of time. Since, I normally play squishy rainbows, so I just don't really think about it too much. But I will say that, if you are going to be relying on incarnate, parts of your bless, Putting that on a really squishy chassis comes with risks. So I wouldn't necessarily do that again either. And I guess as a final point, this is a very all or nothing proposition because, and this is kind of true of Berserkers in general, Blood Bond just sort of cranks it up to 11. Since they don't route, right, it's win or die. So, pretty much every battle that we take our Vanheers into, it's win or die. You don't get a lot of retreats with this setup, hence our Pretender's name. Also should probably note that Blood Bond is a bit of an Achilles heel. I was aware of that. This is just because, any spell that over damages, Gifts from Heaven is, of course, the typical example. Normally when that 150 damage, hits your 15 hit point sacred, that's fine. It's just a lot of wasted damage. But since Blood Bond will spread that damage out to your other units, that rock is going to kill a lot more guys. I do think this is something that you can probably play around. Certainly if you're in a really good room, and somebody's rushing evocation, I guess, which isn't that common, and they just, go for you, that could be a problem. But again, this is a full house game, so everybody is going to be in it. Even though this build is focused on the Vanheers, I don't think that you can really win a game this big using only your sacreds, which is, also kind of why that's part of where the Dormant came from. I didn't want to completely trash the scales because I was concerned that it's okay, we're going to have a great start, maybe make it up to turn 30, even turn 40, doing really well, but it's can you really outrace scales that bad in a game this large? At the time, I didn't really think so. Now, having seen more games, I think it might be possible. But, I definitely think it would be a challenge. And then, again, related to Blood Bond, being an Achilles heel, eventually you're going to have to get away from the Vanheers somewhat anyway. So I wasn't overly worried about this going into it, but definitely something to keep in mind. Anyway, certainly not a perfect build, but once it gets rolling, it does chop. So we'll see how expansion goes for us next week.